All right, folks, here we are, Jude, part 3. Pastor Kevin with you, bringing you a few questions to kind of bring your dialogue to a greater richness. We have no time for an icebreaker this time. There's going to be a good amount of reading, so I'd like you to jump straight in. The first thing I want you to do is just simply read Jude 11 through 60 out loud, 11 through 16 out loud, slowly among yourselves, and just listen very carefully. Okay, we're jumping straight in. Um, you know that there's these three things that happen straight out of the chute. Isaac's talked about triads. We've talked a little bit about how these triplets are pretty popular to Jude. I'm going to give you three questions, and I'm going to give them to you right in a row. So it's going to take, you're not going to see me again for a while because you need to do some reading about context of these stories and kind of discussing them and how they actually apply to Jude itself. So there's a story of Cain, there's a story of Balaam, and then there's a story of Korah's rebellion. So I'm going to have you go and investigate those a little bit and then kind of get all of your ideas and thoughts together on each of them one at a time, and then we'll come back and get to the next thing. All right, so you've done a good amount of investigation into the Old Testament context of these three examples that Jude uses. What I want you to do now is I'm going to ask you to read through this section of Jude again, 11 through 16, and I want you to basically come up with a single word that you think describes what's happening in this section. I mean, there's all this very metaphoric language that's describing what these people have done and what they are and kind of the dangers that they are and how judgment is upon them, right? So what I want you to do is just read through it. You don't have to go very slow this time. Just I want you to read through it. You've read through it already once. This will give you an opportunity to say, yeah, this passage is X. Give that word and then kind of back yourself up. Why would you use that word? So if I were to give you my answer, it leads right into the next question. This very passage begins with one single word. It says, woe. Woe to, right? So it's this idea of woe is something familiar. Maybe some of you remember in the New Testament Jesus speaking of this, and that's going to be your next investigation. What I want you guys to do is open up your Bibles and go to Matthew 23 and read the woe passages. I believe it's 13 through 26. And I want you to think about who is this? Who is Jesus speaking to? Right? What's going on here? And how does that actually compare to who Jude is speaking of? Right? There's this really interesting idea that the target is similar, right? So take a look at that. One of the helpful things when you actually come to the Bible, even if you don't know the original languages, is to look at particular types of words and see how they're used. In this case, I want you to look at Jude 11 alone, just Jude 11, and I want you to pull out the verbs. Those are the action words. For those of you who don't remember your schooling stuff, which is totally fine, I happen to have taken Greek recently, so you get very familiar with the English parts of speech in order to read the Greek ones. So I want you to look at all the action words and look at kind of the pattern that they're going in and tell me what tense they are if you remember. So for those of you who don't remember, if you ever watched Schoolhouse Rock, verb, that's what's happening. I get my thing in action, right? So you just remember that, use that as your guide. Now go. So you probably figured it out. They're all in the past tense. So it's basically, these are things that had already happened. They walked, they abandoned. What was that? They rebelled? No, they perished in Korah's rebellion. So you can see that there's a cycling up of these are like darker and heavier words each one, and they're in the past tense, which is just, it's interesting because you're going to see now from here forward it's going to shift a little bit. It's going to describe them in the present tense of these are hidden reefs and those type of things. So rather than they this is what they were in the past, that is now what, like, kind of their implications and the concern you should have about them. Now, in Jude 13, there's actually one particular term that is used, that has already been used in Jude on about a different group, and I want you to find that. Okay, there's this term, gloomy darkness, and I want you to go back into earlier in the book of Jude, find where that is, who is it about, and why do you think that there's this parallel? Why do you think that there's this connection? So you found out, right? It was actually about kind of the angels, and they're locked away. Man, this is some harsh and vivid language. In fact, what we're going to get into now is in Jude 16. It seems like the vivid metaphoric language that are in verses 12 and 13 now shift into more, what I'll consider more anthropomorphic language. It truly is human language now. So all of those things that Isaac had talked about, how it's talking about air and land and sea and sky. They were all metaphors associated with all of the realms of God's creation. They now have moved into real tangible words in Jude 16 about these folks. Now, I'd ask you, have you ever, these are harsh terms, but maybe ever have you identified someone in this way? Have you ever been identified in this way? Right? Why would you have done that? Why would you have used these type of terms? Because I think it helps us maybe a little bit understand Jude's not just being harsh. These false teachers, there are things that they're doing that are clearly against our faith and our King. So here's an add-on question. If any of you can identify with being a little bit like any of those terms in Jude 16, do you still fall back into those patterns? Do you ever fall into any of those terms, grumbling and malcontented, following sinful desires, loudmouth boasters, favoritism, or you're showing favoritism? I think it's important for us to be able to look deeply within ourselves. So all I'm asking you right now is maybe take a moment to identify some of those patterns that are still in your life, even if you are Christian, that you realize, yeah, sometimes I slide back into this. And this is not a thing to shame you. This is not a thing to identify how bad you are. But I think it's important to recognize we can sometimes be purveyors of the same thing. We can cause the same things to continue on. And sometimes we have to ask ourselves why. What are the reasons we fall back into it? So Jude has laid this verbal hammer down, describing these folks who've infiltrated the church. And I think it's fair to say that we have the same problems today. But I think one of the concerns here is these are people coming in with authority. I had before told you to look at the woe passages. And the thing that's common about these is Jesus and Jude, in this example, are talking about those that are in authority, the false teachers, the ones who are actually, Jesus would say, tying the heavy burdens around folks, right? They're making this faith more difficult than it ought to be. They're giving it an undue weight that they aren't even willing to carry themselves. And Jude is talking about false teachers as well. He's saying woe to false teachers because this is what they do and this is how you should be careful of them, right? That's this passage. It's a woe passage. It's a passage about how false teachers that are in our midst, this is what they're like, and this is the judgment that they will experience. And we have to be really careful around that. But, so here's the thing. It brings us around to this idea of talking about authority, like how we view authority, because we've talked about this, I believe, in Jude part 1. No one likes to submit. We don't like authority very much. It's part of our culture. It's part of, especially in the United States. We came from a monarchy and rejected it and came and started a new place, a new nation. And it was based upon some of these freedoms and a level of individuality and so forth. But it has led us down a path of not really respecting authority or having problems with authority. So what I want you to do is think about, there maybe are certain particular authority figures in your life, or there's types of authority that you have trouble submitting to. And I'm not just saying like it's the church. It might be other ones. It might be a teacher you had in school. It might be a parent. It might be any number of things. I want you to identify maybe one or two of those areas in each of your lives and talk about it and try to figure why. Why was it that you could not submit to that authority? And there may be perfectly good reasons, right? There are good reasons at times. But the thing is that culturally we have to be aware that we carry this mantle of not wanting to submit to authority. Submitting to authority in a lot of ways is kind of a bad thing. That's why we're in a democracy where everyone has their voice, so to speak. So I think there's this way that sometimes this idea of not submitting to authority can roll over into our faith as well. And maybe there are things that we aren't submitting to that we should, and we really don't have good reasons. And this is part of the exercise. Dig into that and figure out what are a couple of those areas where you have had trouble with authority. And then we'll come back. So we're at the end of our section today, and I kind of want to talk about an application here. We talked about how maybe some of these ways that these false teachers, the ways that they're acting, this grumbling, maybe boastful, maybe sinful desires, whatever they are, that even some of those things exist in us, and we have to root those out and we have to confess them. But I think that there's another thing here, and it's the question of how do we recognize true authority? Like, how should we recognize it? What does it look like? And man, it's the same answer to all of these questions we ask you. I apologize. But there is no better answer than as we look at a king on his cross. What does the one who has true authority over our life and death, what does he do but sacrifice himself on a cross so that we all might be able to come to him? That we all might be able to walk into his divine throne room, that we might be able to access the throne of grace. That's crazy. So what does that authority look like? Well, I tell you what, it doesn't use power like the rest of the world does, right? That's one thing specifically. In this authority, those that have this kind of authority will show you through sacrificial living. They'll show you it's not just simply a question of, hey, you're supposed to submit, so submit. I think there are things you will be able to recognize than just simply a rule like that. Because let's face it, if someone just tells you to do something, you might do it for a little while, but eventually you're going to ask yourself, why am I doing this? Or something is not going to go right, you're not going to like it, so you're going to rebel. How is it that authority is so powerful, so gracious, and so good, so merciful, so forgiving, that we would submit to it in every case? It looks like a king on a cross. So what I'm praying you guys would do is just think about, how is it we recognize this type of authority? How do we recognize the authority of a king like Jesus? What would that look like in the world? And then also, I'm going to suggest to you, you have to ask the question, how can you submit to it? Well, to be honest, without the Spirit reminding you of this king on a cross, that is the image. That is an image worth submitting to. That is an image that is so beautiful and so dreadful at the same time. Yet we can feel ownership for this event, this cosmic event. We can all feel that ownership because of the fact that we are grumblers. We're boastful. We still have our sinful desires. But see, we can walk away with thankfulness. We can keep going to the cross and walking with thankfulness back into the world, going to the cross, walking away with thankfulness. I pray that you would recognize that today. Maybe that's the prayer. Father, let us all continue to return to the cross and walk away recognizing your goodness, your graciousness, and being so very thankful that it's easier to submit even to those authorities that maybe aren't good, that maybe aren't merciful like you, because we saw you do it. You had all authority, but you submitted. So I pray that maybe that is part of your ending conversation, maybe how you really think about this week, that you would come back to the cross and remember submission to authority is good. Our King did it best. He submitted to the Father first. He submitted to earthly rulers in the sense of it had to be done in order for our forgiveness, for us to be brought home. So that in and of itself should be the thing that makes it easier for us. We continue to look to the cross.